I'm back. Okay, part two of chapter one in Hind's Feet on High Places. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings. Left alone in the cottage, Mrs. Dismal Forebodings brooded on the disastrous news, and the more she brooded, the worse it seemed. What a cruel blow dealt by fate to permit that girl to return just now, who, if she had married Craven as she ought to have done, would now be as disgraced and humiliated and wretched as her mother-in-law, and a convenient scapegoat on whom the family could have heaped their reproaches. But now, instead of that, here she was, gloriously free, richly provided for, and with an honorable new name. "It's scandalous," sobbed Mrs. Dismal. "The injustice of life, the hammer blows of fate, a calamity of calamities." She sat there brooding bitterly for perhaps half an hour, when she heard a light tap on the door of the cottage, and with a sickening sense of foreboding, she called out sourly, "Who is there?" "It is I, your niece, dear aunt. May I come in?" And with that the door opened, and Grace and Glory stepped into the cheerless room. In spite of herself, Mrs. Dismal Forebodings looked with eager curiosity at the girl who had once been much afraid. She saw it was quite true what Mrs. Valiant had told her. There was a great difference in her. She was so straight, and walked with such ease and poise, that it gave one the impression that she was much taller than before. And now that the unsightly, deformed mouth was healed, and she could look unshrinkingly, without self-consciousness, into the face of others, she was very unlike the ugly creature of former days. "Yes, in another way," thought Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, "she is not at all out of the ordinary. Among a crowd there would be nothing to single her out, except perhaps the expression of quiet, steady happiness on her face and the light in her eyes." Grace and Glory hesitated a moment at the door, and then, as her aunt offered not a single word of greeting, she walked quietly toward the gray bent figure crouched in the rocking chair beside the stove, and stooping down, gently kissed her aunt's cheek. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings recoiled, almost as though a reptile had approached her, and putting out her hands pushed her niece away. "There is no need for insincere tokens of affection, much afraid," she said coldly. "I can dispense with a kiss from you." Her niece looked at her compassionately, but only said gently, "I can understand just how you feel, dear aunt. I know that I was always sadly lacking in love and in attention to your wishes. But I hear that you have experienced much sorrow since last we saw one another, and my heart aches for you. I long to be able to help in some way, or at least to share your sorrow." She paused a moment and then added shyly, "I have been changed, you know, since I went away. I have learned to love. I have a new name now, and I hope a new nature." "So I heard from Mrs. Valiant," said her aunt icily, "but I shall certainly not call you by anything but your real name. It will take more than just a new name, I can assure you, to make me forget that you were what you were before. To me you will always be much afraid." "Well, I can understand that too," said Grace and Glory, "and you may call me by the old name if you so please. But Grace is a shorter and easier name to say, and it exactly describes the means by which all the happiness and peace and healing had come to me. Dear Aunt Dismal, if only I could persuade you, in your sorrow and grief and pain, to turn to the one who so graciously and wonderfully helped me. A flush of angry color appeared on her aunt's cheeks. Do I understand you to refer to... She stumbled over the hated name. To the shepherd, much afraid. Yes, answered her niece earnestly. I beg. No, I rather I command that you will not ever mention that name to me again, said Mrs. Dismal Forebodings in a voice shaking with angry excitement. You know well enough what all of us thought about your disgraceful behavior, forsaking all your relatives in the most heartless manner. But do you know what happened afterwards? Do you know that it was that that shepherd of yours who trumped up the false charge against my unhappy son Craven, which resulted in his being put in prison? My son, my only son, treated as a common felon and sentenced to a 6 months' term of imprisonment. Grace and Glory, who had come to the cottage with her heart overflowing with love and compassionate longing to help her aunt escape from misery which she herself had known, could think of nothing to say. She had her own personal memories of Craven fierce bullyings, and could well understand how some hapless victim must have rejoiced to be delivered by the shepherd out of his clutches. Also, that a term in prison might well prove to be a salutary, though bitter, lesson to him. But she did not feel that it was the moment to suggest all this to his mother. So she really did not know what to say. It was the dreadful contrast to everything which she had hoped and expected, thought Grace and Glory to herself, which made it so unspeakably difficult. Up there on the high places in the kingdom of love, where every thought was love, and her companions' joy and peace were never absent, how different things had looked. She remembered how, but a short time before, she had been sitting beside the king in the royal gardens, and they had looked down into this valley, and her heart had ached and throbbed with compassion and with the longing to be able to help her relatives. Nothing had seemed too difficult for love to undertake if only they could be rescued and delivered from the tormenting things by which they were enslaved. But now, down here, face to face with reality, how different, how almost impossibly different it seemed. Here was her aunt, absolutely shut up within her own miserable self. She could think of nothing else, be interested in nothing else, for all her thoughts were claimed to the one wretched center. She was outside the realm of love, as though she lived in a world of outer darkness where love simply did not exist. How, oh how, thought Grace and Glory desperately, could one get into her dungeon, and how could one strike off the chains which the prisoner seemed actually to cherish and to be unwilling to be rescued from? How could one even speak to her of the only deliverer, when she believed that he was the cause of all her unhappiness? Yes, indeed, it was the one thing up there in the glory and light of the kingdom of love to feel a passionate longing to help and save. But when one got right down into the midst of the actual reality, how was it to be done? How could one reach hearts immured in impregnable prisons, and how awaken even the beginning of a desire for deliverance? Grace and Glory remembered the whole conversation up there on the high places, and how they had all agreed that this was the very likeliest time of all for them to be able to help Mrs. Dismal Forebodings and her family because the calamities which had overtaken them would surely make them begin to feel their need of the shepherd's help. But now it was all so different. She remembered the voice of the king saying, "I need someone to speak for me, for they will not come to me themselves." And her glad, exultant cry that she would be his mouthpiece, she remembered the tone in which he had said, "Do you think they will listen to you, Grace and Glory?" What had she answered? "You shall tell me what to say, and I will say it for you." Yes, thought Grace and Glory suddenly, that is the answer. He must tell me what to say. He must teach me. I can do nothing now, but I will go to him and I will tell him all about it, and I will ask him to teach me what approach I am to make and how to win right through into my aunt's prison house. However, she made one last attempt to break down the antagonism against herself. "Dearest aunt," she said, "I do hope you will sometimes let me come to see you and to do what I can to help. And perhaps next time you will let me tell you how I was delivered from all my fears and sorrows." "Thank you, Much Afraid," said her aunt icily, "but I am not interested. I know already just what you will say, and it is the last thing that I am interested to hear." Grace and Glory, feeling exactly as though she were holding a tiny pebble in her hand with which to try to batter down an impregnable stronghold, rose to her feet and prepared to take her departure. She put her arms around her aunt and kissed the coldly unresponsive cheek, saying softly, "Only let me love you, Aunt Dismal. Let me try to atone in some way for all my lovelessness in the past. Do let me come to see you and my cousin Gloomy and help in any way that I can." But the only answer she received was, "You have chosen and gone your own way, Much Afraid, and it is not my way. And I do not hesitate to tell you that even though misfortune has overtaken me, while good fortune has smiled upon you, I do not at all desire to be pitied and patronized by you. Smitten I may be, and left desolate and friendless, but patronized I will not be. You need not trouble yourself to visit here again." Grace and Glory left the cottage and walked sadly away, wondering if anything could have been more unlike her radiant, loving dreams of helping her relatives than the actual reality. For a few moments she felt almost overwhelmed. When, however, she reached the cottage where she and Mercy had lived together, and found her friend and Mrs. Valiant bustling around full of cheerful preparations for the party to which the chief shepherd himself had been invited, and when she saw Joy and Peace, whom she had left at the cottage, telling herself that if she were accompanied by her two handmaidens when she visited her miserable aunt, that she might appear to be showing off. When she met their loving greetings, she did feel a balm applied to her heart, and she said to herself, "Next time I go to visit Aunt Dismal, I shall take Joy and Peace with me." There was just time before the guests arrived for bustling Mrs. Valiant to take her aside for a moment and whisper, "Well, my dear, how did you get on, and what sort of reception did you receive from that poor creature Dismal?" "She told me never to visit her again," answered Grace and Glory sorrowfully, "and I'm afraid she really meant it." "You would never believe how many times she has said exactly the same thing to me," replied Mrs. Valiant cheerily. "But she would be quick enough to object if I took her at her word. Never pay any attention to anything poor Dismal says, my dear. She is starved for love and doesn't know it. Just go on loving. It always wins in the end." Mrs. Valiant, as you may easily guess without being told, was another who had been with the shepherd to the high places, and wore in her heart the flowering plant of love, which made her a citizen of that kingdom. Then they heard the sound of footsteps outside, and of happy, laughing voices, and the next moment the chief shepherd himself, surrounded by his friends, entered the cottage, and the feast began. The kettle sang on the hearth, the guests talked and laughed merrily together. The yellow cat lay purring on the chief shepherd's knees, and the black and white one curled up on the lap of Grace and Glory. The sheep dogs lay at the door wagging their tails, and Mrs. Valiant busied herself filling and refilling the cups with tea, and all in the cottage was the most mirthful and contented spot in the whole village, just as though a little bit of the kingdom of love had been transplanted down to the valley, which of course was the case. If only poor Dismal were here, sighed Mrs. Valiant just once, and then she looked across at the shepherd and saw that his eyes were looking straight at her, as though he read and understood her thoughts. Then Mrs. Valiant gave a little contented smile and said to herself, "It will be all right. He wants it even more than we do. It will take more than poor Dismal and her unhappy family to evade his love in the end." Then she went on bustling about, filling cups and attending to the wants of everyone, and was, without in the least realizing it, next to the shepherd himself, the most cheering and heart-warming person in the room. And that is the end of chapter 1 of Mountains of Spices. Chapter 1, Mrs. Dismal Foreboding. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace. Bye.